Again, even with the moment of silence, you can pray to yourself, meditate, listen to our moment of silence. Thank you. If you're going to be in a pledge of allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, moving on to public comment. I'm going to have everybody sign up if anybody in the public wishes to speak on public comment. All right, seeing none. Moving on to the approval of the minutes, for any corrections, additions, or deletions to the minutes presented. Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
I'll make the motion.
We have a motion, is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes as presented. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Moving on to updates from council, Mr. Hardy.
I'll go ahead and do this one here. At the last meeting, I talked about some projected road projects. DOT is trying to do a prioritized list of road projects. And, well, road projects and then also bike and ped projects. And right now, the ones that they have for Fletcher, Fanning Bridge Road, all the way over to the airport, modernization. It's on the list, but it's, the last time they scored it, it scored the lowest of the 6 projects on the list. Hopefully now the traffic is worse and there's more development, maybe the score will go up. And then the other one was a bike ped project for Fanning Bridge Road, trying to put pedestrian sidewalks and stuff up Fanning Bridge Road, linking some of the subdivisions. So does everybody feel comfortable with those 2 projects and no other suggestions? Okay,
Can I interject one thing?
Sure.
We actually, I know a little bit more about that from the meeting Mark and I had today, is that they've actually kind of put them both on there. Because at one point Tristan suggested that it be submitted in 2 different ways because there might be more likelihood of a pedestrian project, for example, like a sidewalk, if they didn't go forward with the whole modernization project. So it's on there kind of being doubly considered. So ultimately, if they go with the modernization, that would likely include like ped improvements. And
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I could even live with them cutting Fanning Bridge Road up, and to me, the highest priority is the turn lane right here.
Yeah.
But it's all a matter of what money is available and a lot of other
In
things.
that excuse me, Bob, in that meeting that Eric was referencing, I tried to reinforce the right
Good.
turn lane, among other things they consider on the road, so, yeah.
All right. Thank you. Any other updates from council?
Just to reiterate, the job fair, I think it'd be a good idea for the police department to have a booth next year. Because some of the other the Black Mountain and Button County Sheriff, the ALE, and the state police were there. And it's a free booth for us. They don't charge. So I think it'd be maybe, a potential spot to find somebody.
It's a good idea.
And I'll also mention, although you and Sheila were there, concert they had Saturday night, that might be the biggest crowd I've ever seen there, and they stayed there right till the very end.
That is where the contract part was excellent. Like, we tried to stay home, like, it was very hot. So, that's a kudos to everybody.
That goes to show you, if you get good bands in there, people
People
will
stay, All right, any other updates? All right, seeing none, moving on to the consent agenda. Any questions, comments concerning any item on there? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
There a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
There a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries. Moving on to the public hearing, consideration of the amendments to the land development code. We have Mr. Zoning Director.
Just a quick word, you'll see the agenda item, as when I first updated you on this last month, we were just talking about the cryptocurrency mining. Just so you don't think we were trying to run anything by you as if you weren't paying attention. I did bundle a couple of other little minor, what we felt were housekeeping amendments under this for your consideration tonight so that we could try and package it in under the one public hearing. If there's any discomfort whatsoever with going forward on either the second two bullets on that item, you could continue that to next month and come back to it. But just wanted, I think they're fairly simple, so I'll try and bulldoze my way through all of them tonight and see where it lands. As we talked about last month, this first one was in regard to the cryptocurrency mining operation use. Planning board did ultimately recommend defining it, getting it in Article 18 under the definition section, so it's broken out as a separate definition. And they did, after some discussion, more discussion than I thought was going to happen, but they did end up just suggesting not allowing it in any zoning district, so it's defined in the ordinance and then in the permitted use table of Article 2, listed under the list of uses, but then you would see in the chart slash marks through all the zoning districts, in essence, to not allow it anywhere. The discussion centered around whether or not, and I didn't have answers for them, but the question, are these any louder than your typical manufacturing operation? We don't know that, but so there was discussion about whether or not they should be allowed in the M1 zoning district. It came circled towards saying that since we haven't had any questions about this use, we don't really know what we're dealing with, that we recommend this approach first. We can always return to it later if an entity inquires about it and really wants to request that we talk about a text amendment to get it into the industrial section. So that's where that one got left off.
Well, everything I've seen on the news said they are crazy loud with the cooling fans, and the one that I saw that was over in Marion, not Marion,
Jackson,
yeah. They said people that live quite a ways away were still complaining about the noise.
And that's kind of where I said that, based on kind of the hearsay of the news, that was what we were understanding it. It did seem like, Buncombe County, I don't know where they landed. I think they did pass their moratorium. I think we're being pretty quick with getting an actual text amendment in about it. But I sensed, I don't know where Henderson County stands. I think they were looking at allowing it in a zoning district, but with a lot of crazy spacing requirements that in my mind make it, why not just outright start limiting it. But I say this, the school government, I didn't call them about this use, but in the past, a couple times we've done this before with electronic gaming and asphalt plants. Those aren't necessarily protected uses that you have to allow somewhere by statute, but, the school government is good at, arguing both sides in a professorial way, to say that, you can ban it, and then if you get challenged, you can lose. So we've erred in the past on the side of caution, and so far we've been fortunate. So that's all on that one. Unless there are any questions about crypto mining operations. I basically lifted the definitions in your packet straight from the way the county was defining. If you'd like, I can go on to the next two and then ultimately consider a motion for all of them. Okay. Article 4 of the code has a very brief blurb about RVs and campers. And, it's something that I forget exactly what year we amended the code. Keith, I'm not sure if you were yet on planning board when we did that, but it was the question over occupying campers and RVs. 30 days, and the ordinance said they could do that 4 times a year. Where that ordinance was a little mushy, subject to interpretation, is could those 30-day periods be run consecutively, effectively allowing you to get dug in for 120 days. I think there's been a couple times we've told people they could do that because the ordinance wasn't clear. I went back to the planning board about it for clarification, and in their minds, it was not the intent to allow those periods to run consecutively, so they made a recommendation to add language really just saying, clarifying that the 30-day time period shall not be consecutive. And then there was also the recommendation to strike one word, that's residential, because we allow it on a residential lot. The question, why did we want to just not say you can do that on a commercial lot? We had a situation a few years back where a shopkeeper had his RV out back and kind of stayed it once in a while. It wasn't a violation, it wasn't permanently hooked up or anything. But, so we struck the word residential for the recommendation. So if there's any question on that?
So, you want a question now?
Sure, yeah, hold on.
I've just become aware in the last several months that sometimes somebody will come up here with a camper and they'll stay through a season, like a couple of months at a time. So I wonder if that should be something we should consider, because like a lot of folks will come up here in the mountains, in the heat of the summer from Florida or wherever, and then, go down to Florida for 2 or 3 months during the winter. So
The idea was to push those into a campground, which we've got the Redwoods Lake RV park.
so then you're limiting a resident from being allowed to rent out a lot on their own acreage.
Yeah.
I don't know that you have that many that even do that, but, I don't understand why it would matter. If it's on residential property, who cares if they have a camper there for 2 months at a time?
I get that, and I'm not comfortable with any way you regulate this. I'm not completely comfortable with this being under the zoning umbrella, because I've always heard it's a building code thing that they state campers shall not be, we're not designed to be permanently occupied.
No.
You got people living in them in the RV parks. I mean, there are people that stay there, and the county's not going out and doing that. And what we would run into, when our ordinance on the zoning end was silent about this a few years back, and we had in there what we have now, it was largely because we kept having this issue come up once in a while. And, essentially the county would get a call about someone staying in a camper, and they'd punt it back to us and say, well, let zoning deal with that. And it's like, to me, it's like a clear-cut building code thing, but anyway, there's no easy way to regulate this. That's just where we landed a few years ago, was to say that you could do 30 days at a time, up to 4 times a year. So that it was clearly temporary in nature. The other scenario was where if someone's under an active building permit to be building a house on a vacant lot, the ordinance says you can live in a camper while you're under active permits to be building their house. So it's any way you deal with this issue, it's hard to enforce. I mean, we're really going to be like anything, it's going to be complaint driven. So, there could be campers out back at mom's house somewhere for a year, and if the neighbors don't complain, we're not generally going to know about it. But this is where we've had a few issues come up where what's kind of triggered me to go back to the planning board about it is I was dealing with kind of a hardship situation that was really kind of a difficult situation involving, kids being cared for by grandparents in the main house while a person lived out back, that was having issues, but so they were close to their kids, but not in charge of their kids.
And that was going to be my next question. What about hardships?
Yeah, and anywhere you go,
total different times than what we were 40 years ago.
we did a lot of research. Couldn't find any local jurisdiction that has any kind of hardship exemption for this. Olga Ruman, who's on our planning, one of our newest members on the planning board, she actually researched further and wider than Teresa did and found like one isolated case somewhere up in the Pacific Northwest, where there was a hardship type exemption that like the administrator, like, you know, my counterpart for whatever jurisdiction that was, would be able to like gauge hardship and say, yeah, it's okay. But our planning board didn't feel comfortable with putting in anything like that. I found that anytime you deal with a lot of facets of zoning code enforcement, you're gonna get, you know, a lot of hardship situations, from the junky lot situations to the camper situations, and I know there's legit hardships out there. A few years ago, you know, when Eddie Henderson was still on board with us, he, you know, had a situation where someone was coming to him about like a daughter who was in an abused situation who was needing to stay in a camper. I think that's where we first employed the interpretation to say, well, we'll let you stretch those 30-day periods out, you know, to run consecutively, because that bought her essentially 4 months. But realized we needed to talk about, and I went to the board intending to talk about these hardship situations, but in the end, you know, there was pretty much clarity to come back at. There was talk about wanting to ban it entirely, simply because building code says thou shalt not occupy a camper. It's not my job to enforce building code, but that's kind of where it landed a few years ago. So I don't know if you want to.
Is there any way we could add verbiage that would be kind of like our special use permit for land, that you could add to say something to that effect, unless previously approved for hardship or any other stay over 30 days?
I don't know how you do it, and this is where we get to that point in the conversation where I recognize this may be one that we do punt from consideration tonight to look at it further. Because I don't think you want to get into something like this as unwieldy as like a special use process, because I mean, that ultimately, you know, someone in that's going to have an acute situation, and a special use process is going to be a 3-month thing that goes for 2 to 3 months, planning board, council.
Eric often gets in a quandary with code enforcement issues that are, I know this is a type of code enforcement, but code enforcement in the sense like our solid waste ordinance is probably the most common one, or abandoned vehicles ordinance, and there's often a hardship story here.
This is going to be one of those situations where they're not going to come to us largely asking permission to do it. It'll have already happened, and then we're getting a complaint about it. And then the complainer is owed kind of, if there's an ordinance about it,
Want an explanation.
they're owed action. And, you know, I usually buy time by explaining that, hey, we don't really start with a heavy stick unless it's like the grossest violation. But you know, we often write contact letters that are to inform and educate people about the ordinance before, and then give time to comply before sending out and asking notice of violation, for example.
And we're kind of experiencing that now in Fanning Bridge recently, and often with the pop-up camper in the people's driveway. So that would.
And that was the question I had. What is meant by the sentence, the RV or camper must be properly licensed and registered? Does that mean
Just
licensed
meaning
to
like
be on
it's
the
got a
road?
vehicle. Yeah, I mean, you know how like, I mean, if you're seeing someone driving down the highway going on vacation, you know, those things have to have a tag. So in essence, that was added, I guess, to,
Make sure it's
It's a
legal,
vehicle,
it's
yeah.
registered,
Right.
it's.
So could this
Has to
ordinance,
have-
yeah.
so could this ordinance be used against the problem there on Fanning Bridge Road?
Well, ironically, the camper's not even a part of the current enforcement action, because that came so late in the game. Right now, it's solely about the solid waste that built up. The camper, I'm not even going there yet, because all the letters we've written that property, we have never had contact from the owner, except one occasion where somebody called claiming to represent the property, saying they had been away for a while. And we're sorry that it had gotten to that point, and then that's when it got cleaned up briefly, and then a few months later it fell back into violation. That camper hasn't really been addressed yet, and I'm assuming that there's a current foreclosure process going on with that house, and I think that's going to take care of everything.
So basically, this ordinance would prohibit someone from having a non-licensed
same in my mind as the junk vehicle ordinance, because, the ordinance will let you have a vehicle that's operable but not tagged, or a car that's tagged but not operable. Doesn't have to be both yet. But, a camper, if it's tagged, we know that means it can be taken out immediately, so you could interpret that someone's not necessarily permanently occupying it. It was just kind of one other helpful piece of evidence if you got in a situation like that. So,
Because we do have another situation just outside of town, behind the old Chinese restaurant, where there appears to be more and more of these campers and people living in and behind it. And I know that's out of our area, but I wouldn't want that on Main Street in our area right here.
It's going to be a growing problem, and that's why one of the reasons I felt compelled to go to the planning board about it was to get ahead of it, because we're going to see it more and more often. I don't like the idea of roaming around looking to try and render someone homeless, because like the situation we were dealing with, mentioned, has resolved itself since we first brought this to the planning board a few months ago. But the situation there is you had a mentally unstable person living behind their own family's property where their kids were being taken care of by the grandparents. My wife's a social worker. She said that's the perfect scenario in the social work universe, but it's against building codes, sort of against zoning codes. So,
Well, it keeps that person off the street and.
and exactly, because if I ran them off immediately,
They're
it could
being
have ended up
maintained
down
by
at the truck
families.
stop or downtown somewhere or anywhere. It's that growing, anytime we're watching the news lately about the affordable housing issue and the homeless issue, is where do they go? There's nowhere for them to go. There's the bottom line. And it's a whole other issue, and the biggest jurisdictions in the country and the world can't solve it. So I don't have much to add to that discussion right now. So the question being is one that I actually thought, I could talk about a hardship exemption, but I didn't get it. And so basically, where we left it with planning board was to really just cement the clarification on whether or not those 4 30-day periods were intended to be run consecutively or not. If you disagree with that recommendation, you could just, when you're making your motion on these, you could make a motion to approve, like the crypto mining and this next one I'm going to get to, and then the current language would stay as is, where you could purposefully leave it a little murky and with room for interpretation. So not trying to lead you in one direction, just want to present your options to you.
No, I apologize for not being here last week, and I might have missed some really
Oh,
good
I wasn't
conversation.
here. No, I wasn't here last week.
I provided a quick overview on it. Eric wasn't here to cover
I
it,
would
but
prefer to not vote on it. I'm not comfortable with it. I really just want to mull it over some more. And on the bottom where it says the occupancy of mobile tiny homes on wheels shall be regulated in the same manner, I really think that we need to study that more in depth, because it's just like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. People would get a mobile home, set it up, live there for a little while until they could afford to build a home or buy a home. And so more and more people are having to go to a tiny home for their permanent home. And so I would really like to consider.
That was
looking at
done
that
around
a
the
bit
same
more.
time, because the tiny homes on wheels also were kind of viewed as not meeting the building code and whatnot. So it might take some, and I don't know how much luck we'll have in coordinating some kind of effort on an ordinance with the county, but we could find out how they would view the difference between, tiny home. The way we address tiny homes is that I tell people that are looking to build a home in general, and they ask about tiny homes, is that the residential zoning districts are what they are. They allow each their own certain density, and we say that if you have a half-acre lot in the R1, you can build a single-family dwelling. As long as we don't care if it's 200 square feet or 20,000 square feet, as long as you can meet setbacks, and we know you're going to go on to get your building permit and whatnot. Because usually when you get asked about the tiny homes, they're asking about it in the context of being in addition to or more of them than the current density would prescribe, and we didn't get into that discussion yet. There didn't seem to be a move to be any kind of consensus towards increasing density allowances for tiny homes. And then just at the time, because these tiny homes on wheels were seen sort of in that same category of transient, like RVs or the park model homes, which there's a few of those in the campground. They're not quite mobile homes, though they're viewed more as the camper and RV category, which again don't meet any kind of building code. There's still, at my last zoning conference this past February, there was a seminar on tiny homes and campers, and it's not many people have it figured out in a way that it always kind of comes back to that building code.
Did you go to that seminar?
Yeah, I did.
Were you able to glean much?
I mean, it just was sitting there going, wow, yeah, nobody's really figured out how to deal with this.
Still hadn't got it down? Okay.
So it's like, if we do really want to take an in-depth look at it, I'd want to check in with like the Charlottes and the Raleighs to find out how the big cities are.
Yeah, the dilemma is one person sees it as a blight and wants it off, and then someone else sees it as, well, they should have the option for maybe 30 days, keep it on the
Not
property.
everybody can afford a $400,000 home,
Well,
you know?
Well,
So-
true, but they're not meant to be permanent residences, that's because of the building code.
Well, I think these last few years, there are people who have tiny homes that are permanent. So I think we need to figure out where to allow that, or how to allow that, or what that looks like.
If there's overall consensus among you on that, on what would be that second bullet point on the agenda is like, it's just kind of like when somebody makes a motion to just say excluding the item that we're revolving campers, to say, in essence, what that lets me do is just leave the language alone that we've got, not necessarily put pressure to come back next month with it, but let's just stick a pin in it, I guess you could say. I can report back to the
For a
planning
little bit,
board
at least.
to say that there's, needs to be a lot deeper discussion on it. We'll revisit it.
And Article 2, you're going to discuss that too, right?
Yeah, Article 2, this last bullet point, all that was is, those of you who are on board with us, was in 2018, when we amended the land use code and the land use plan to remove residential allowances from the commercial C1 and C2 zoning districts a few years ago. Inadvertently, in kind of the very general, or the general intent, kind of one of the introductory paragraphs of the section, I accidentally left in the word residential in sort of the description of purpose and intent for the zoning districts. So that last page in your packet where you see the striking through the word residential, and then street level, commercial, and upper level office and residential, I recommended striking that, and planning board, agreed with that. Basically, as a housekeeping item to get consistent with the other amendments that we made where we took residential allowances out of C1 and C2.
We were considering that whole project that had offices on the bottom and residential on the top.
Yeah, but different. We were talking about the portion that was going to be zoned, or that was going to have a residential on it, was on the CBD, which allows high-density residential uses.
Okay.
And we were still wrangling with the prospective developer at the time about whether or not a little section of that land was going to need to be conditionally rezoned to CBD to allow for any other residential use that happened to go on in upper 4. And obviously, all that's been rendered moot for the time being.
Right.
So that was really just something that we found like months and months ago, and we just waited to bundle it in with a batch of technical units as a rational that. So,
I have no trouble with approving these three different areas tonight, but I kind of do agree with Sheila that I think the town ought to look into possibly coming up with ways to allow a subdivision of tiny homes. I mean, just because one person doesn't want to live in a tiny home, that doesn't mean everybody doesn't want to.
Yeah,
I will say that we would allow it, because like the question is going to become more of, do you want to have higher density allowances by zoning district to allow more of them?
And that's why I think we should consider that.
I would agree. I mean, thank you for bringing that up, because we're in an incredible affordability issue in our region. And I think the hardship
It's an answer.
issue, the hardship issue is also valid.
Okay. Having heard that, I don't know whether the sentiment is to approve that recommended item, just as far as the camper language, to not have the consecutive 30-day periods, or to hunt that one out?
To me, I think it's fine, the way he's got it. And I don't really have that much of a problem with the sentence in there about the tiny homes, because it talks about tiny homes on wheels versus one that's, permanent.
Yeah.
So to me, a tiny home on wheels is not much different than a trailer.
It's just practically speaking, it would probably be best to leave that one alone as is, because that's not been subject to any discussion on the planning board.
Right.
At this point, we could certainly come back to it in more discussion. I really want to get a feel for some other jurisdictions to figure out how they have specifically related the actual developments of tiny homes, because I know the Flat Rock that had one, I think, a few years ago. Yeah.
I know you need some sort of standard in place, but we all know there's going to be a neighbor who complains, and just like that camper behind the grandparents, and they're maintaining their family the best they can.
Fortunately, we're not getting bombarded with these right now. It's like that one resolved itself, frankly, because they had enough land. They knew the clock was ticking on them. I was being a little liberal with the clock, but they were working on getting financing for a mobile home under disability, and so their disability. So they have now got a permit to actually have a mobile home that meets standards.
But also, this stuff is basically complaint driven. You're probably not going to run out there and say something to somebody if you don't see a complaint from running neighbor.
I would imagine if something like what you suggested, somebody's here for a season, if I had to guess, they're probably on a piece of property with a pretty significant amount of acreage. And I would hope that because of that, since it is complaint driven, you probably would know about it regardless. I'm not sure if that's the case, but
A scenario, Mayor, like you were saying, like if you're on a 5-acre lot and it's parked in the back there for 2 months, probably, you don't have any close adjoining neighbors, but probably would no one ever, look at that, or complain about it, rather. That's the.
So we're talking about an occupied or unoccupied RV?
Not unoccupied.
Okay, just occupied, okay.
Yeah,
Let's get there.
This is about someone living in a camper or
That's
an
what I'm
RV. Yeah.
Because we know
And
plenty of
saying
people own
that.
RVs and fifth wheels that are just parked in their yard like a vehicle, they hook their truck up to it and take it to the beach. That's not any part of this discussion.
Okay, just making sure.
And I've tried, there's been times I've gotten complaints about an RV being out somewhere and then like someone sees like a hose connected to it and so I'll do a gentle
It's
inquiry letter
amazing.
and find that, well, of course, they've got a hose because they're trying to keep the pipes from freezing in the winter, And I don't know a lot about RVs, but I guess there's plumbing that can freeze and they're trying to keep
This is
it.
stuff you have to do.
But someone sees a drop cord run into it instantaneously. Again, very hard to police because I'm sure I know I've been lied to. You get cynical over some of the health sob stories that you hear because some are legit, but I know I've been played a number of times. Anyway, so I'm hearing that we want to dig deeper into just the general discussion on tiny homes and subdivisions.
And leaving the other
Yeah,
part of the second amendment about not making it unconsecutive. So.
Yeah, I think all 3 points are okay the way they are.
That will just need a motion to approve the ordinance amendments as proposed by, or as recommended by planning board. And then I promise to return to planning board about the other discussion.
I think that's probably appropriate.
Okay, I'll make a motion.
We have to have a public hearing first.
Oh,
Sorry. Is there a motion or is there any more discussion before?
So we're gonna go ahead and shove through with it instead of table it like we first mentioned?
Well, from what I'm hearing, we're gonna go ahead and approve these if that's the will of council. But then Eric, you're gonna go back to planning board and get through some of the minutia regarding tiny homes, I guess, hardships, and there's something else for them.
Just so I'm clear too, it's like, you do want a further discussion on the concept of hardships in camper RV situations.
Yes, I do, and I would like to talk further about the tiny home thing. I understand it's already in place, but
But the tiny home thing will be separate from this,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. I mean, if it happens to time well where we can figure it all out at once, I can bring you a bundle
Right.
deal. Yeah, but yeah, we can we'll revisit both issues. Just, yes,
When do you think we would revisit the issues? If we were to table the second option, the second bullet, what would be the time limit that we would have something?
I'm sure we could work on it by next month, couldn't we?
well,
It's,
I mean, we're small staff, I have vacation at the end of the month. It might take a little bit because you had to go far and wide to find one example of hardship allowance on RVs and campers that was out in the Pacific Northwest. And I had, I think it was in Oregon, and I had a couple of comments with planning, well, we don't want to be like Oregon, that kind of sentiment.
Well, but if we're having questions about it, then it's kind of an issue in a way. I mean,
It was
could be.
pretty, it was a unanimous recommendation off the planning board. So I don't know, ultimately, we may get one set of recommendations from planning board that you could end up, going a different way on.
Well, doesn't the council always have the option of doing a variance?
It's not a variance per se. I mean, variances that's under the zoning board of adjustments. And again, I don't know, that's a slippery slope. So variances are usually something very specific, like a setback. It doesn't get into uses. You don't vary on use. And this is one of those nebulous kind of perceived as temporary uses that I don't think the school of government would say, no, that's not intended to be something you consider a variance for. It would get into like changing your code to have it regulated the way your jurisdiction want it regulated, which, I mean, you're not going to ever have agreement, in this day and age. But, we can put together, some language that we go back to planning board and talk about, and, they may come out with a recommendation saying that we don't want to change anything, and in which case I would just bring the verbiage back to you guys to consider it all over in the future public hearing. But I could probably have something on it. I mean, again, what I would suggest is, the easiest would be amending the ordinance taking those the first bullet point and the third bullet point, and making a motion to approve those, and just not changing anything to RVs and campers, period, knowing that we're going to launch into it.
Exactly.
And then try and be back in.
Approve it and then redo it.
Yeah, try and be back in the fall. And again, because we're not getting bombarded with these,
Right.
and if I know there's an active discussion, if we get into anything with a
We
really,
don't have a huge issue right now.
yeah,
So we've got some
exactly.
time.
If somebody came out of left field with a complaint about a really egregious case, I could simply say, hey, I'm not taking action because there's an active discussion going on about how to treat this situation. It's not completely clear in our code.
Okay.
Look at that, as long as we don't drop it, we keep moving forward, trying to research.
there's still the regulation that you're only supposed to be doing it 30 days. This is just giving a clarification that you can do it 4 times a year, you can't do it consecutively. So we'll leave it somewhat nebulous there until we come back with some maybe suggestions.
So if we don't have it within-
hardship stuff.
So if we don't have it by the next month, you'll have it by the following month? Would that be reasonable?
Let's see, this is.
Well, you said you're.
Well, probably in
Yeah,
front
it's
of,
an extra month.
I'd probably be back in front of planning board in September on it. And then we'll be back in front of you guys by October, November. something like that. Again, this is not a burning, I was starting to get a little worried when I had 2 active situations involving campers, both of them, resolved since then.
Yeah, this is not an urgent thing. Eric just did put out here for efficiency's sake, since it was something that came up for discussion rather than another public, but it's fine to table this if you aren't that comfortable with that part.
That's what I'm hearing.
Okay.
All right, so.
Table 2 and approve 1 and 3?
Yeah, we still need to do the public hearing, but after the public hearing, we'll have to do a motion to approve the first board and the second, or the third board, excuse me, and exclude the second board.
Okay.
Right.
So, is there a motion in a public hearing?
So moved.
Is there a motion, is there a second?
Second?
We have a motion and a second in the public hearing, discussion. All in favor of the public hearing, say aye. Those opposed? We're in public hearing. Anybody wishing to speak to the public hearing? Seeing none, we have a motion to close the public hearing.
Make a motion to close.
All right, we have a motion to close, we have a second.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? We're outside the public hearing. Now I'll ask for a motion to amend the land development code, Article 218 regarding the use of cryptocurrency mining operations, Article 2 regarding a reference to residential uses in C1 and C2, and exclude Article 4 regarding RVs and campers.
I'd like to make a motion
Okay.
to approve the first and the third items, Article 2 and 18, and Article 2 regarding reference to residential uses, and exclude Article 4 on RVs and campers.
Okay. We have a motion, is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second, is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries.
Let me interject one more thing. Sure. Just a note for Christine, is I had given Christine an ordinance document for you to sign.
Yeah, no, I
Just
understand.
in case.
Don't
Just
just
rip it up.
Yeah.
I'll have to edit it and
Gotcha.
get you a copy. So,
Okay.
Thank you, Eric.
thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate all your work.
Happy vacation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Seems very well deserved after this.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to item number 5, update on the town center project. Mr. Manager, I think last week discussion, Sheila, you weren't here, but I think most council, the consensus was to ask staff to see if reaching out directly to the interested parties. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at that item and work on
Yeah,
it.
and just, yeah, if you want me just briefly,
Yeah.
so, I've been talking to you about coming back and trying to discuss some different options and kind of where we go from here, since, the Waddells and Lewis Real Estate Group have officially, kind of stepped away from trying to re-engage us in the contract that we previously had with them. So, and we did some debriefing with Martin Lewis, of Lewis Real Estate Group, who's part of the developer team, and he like strongly expressed that the restriction of no left turn lane or no left turn movement into the site was the main reason they stepped away from it. So I said, well, let's at least talk to DOT, and we have a new district engineer, Troy Wilson, and so Eric and I met with the new district engineer and the assistant district engineer, Rusty, who had been involved with this previously, Rusty Darnell, and they basically, stuck to their recommendations, and because it's, and they pointed out, backed up by data, traffic data on Fanny Bridge Road and in the vicinity, and in particular, some accident history, and we've had, some fatalities at some of these intersections, and, some not too long ago. So that fed into it, and some of the federal requirements, and just the practicality. I mean, we know you can, at off times, meaning non-rush hour times, and those rush hour times are that 7:30 to 8:30, 4:30 to 5:36, you can get in there and turn left. Relatively safely, you can do that. It's in those other times where it's not particularly safe and not really practical. I mean, some people wouldn't even attempt it if you see how it gets backed up there some days. So, but we wanted to go over the recommendations of the traffic impact analysis, all these mitigation improvements, and that left turn, restricted left turn movement in there. They basically said you'd have to look at doing another analysis because, we realize, I think the developer, if you give up some improvement that's supposed to deal with the traffic and the activity there, you might have to do something else to, quote, mitigate it. So that was essentially the feedback we got from them this morning, when Eric and I met with the district and assistant district engineer, which, I mean, we weren't shocked by that. I guess another good takeaway from our discussions was trying to get a little bit more front-end input from DOT. I mean, once the developer has clearly articulated, you know, what would be going in there, and like, you know, the impact as far as trips and, you know, the activity, then they can, at least on the front end, bounce that off with DOT about what might be required to get the driveway permit, or if it gets pushed into, if it generates enough trips, they have to do this traffic impact analysis like we had to deal with this. So that was another good takeaway. But the three things that I basically last week talked about, we've had good engagement with some other parties, Windsor-Built Homes and Magnolia Properties are some of them. And Windsor-Built Homes, Windsor-Built, their commercial division has, they're analyzing this very closely right now. They're having some communications with the railroad to talk about the what ifs if they encroach in the right of way, which our former developer had a plan to do that, was already working on an agreement, what the fee structure would be. And so they're looking at it. Magnolia Properties is evaluating it. They've pointed out some issues about the grade, how it falls kind of dramatically from the front of the property to the back, or from the west side to the east side back this way. The value on there, the cost and the price, and some of these issues not mitigating that or bringing that price down a little bit. And then the railroad right away, getting tenants in there, because that is an issue with some. If they know there's any remote chance that improvements you put in there that the railroad can unilaterally withdraw that or make you have to move. You know, parking and some of these other things aren't, I mean, they're risky, but not like putting a building in there, that kind of. And our former developer was looking at parking and part of the road going through there. To give some perspective on this in attracting other entities and knowing those risks, we had businesses operating there for years and years who didn't have, I mean, that was ever brought to the town's attention, problems operating, because most of them encroached in the railroad right away. Some of them were paying fees, like former Fletcher Lawn and Garden. They had an agreement, fee structure with the railroad, and they were operating in buildings that were physically in the railroad right away. Yeah, and it didn't really affect their operation. Plus, there was a road. If you remember, Johnston Road was a road that ran back there and encroached in it. So this can be done, and you can, factor in some risk here without having to be so fearful about getting that commitment from businesses in there. So we think this is something we can work through. It is a legitimate challenge. Our former developer record, they were working through it. But yeah, I mentioned that, continuing the dialogue. We know we have interested parties that are looking at this. Or do we go do an RFP again, a request for proposals like we did initially about 2.5 years ago? Or do we look at some other use of the property, like a single retail use or single office commercial use, instead of the mixed use that we're trying to get? It's more consistent with the vision for the town center. And so the kind of the consensus discussion from last week was to stay on the current track of, engaging these developers that I've mentioned, these other interested parties. And maybe timing wise, it might not be the best to be running out and doing RFP right now. So I think we need to monitor this. I think we need to revisit it again and see, do we need to consider those other options if we're not getting the activity happening on there, getting into a contract or a potential beyond contract. So that was the gist of last week discussion on it.
Sounds so comfortable with you all just continue to reach out to our interested parties. Are you okay with that? That sounds like a consensus.
Okay, great.
Any
Thank
other
you.
discussion on it?
Makes common sense.
I think so. More, do you have anything else to
I don't, other than, just let you know what happened with DOT, because I said we were gonna follow up based on, Mark Lewis's comments
Sure.
about the left turn restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on, item number 6, update on development performance measures. Back to you, Mr. Manager.
Okay, thank you. So last week I talked to you about kind of where we were in these performance measures relative to town services. I shared a draft back in February, and then we worked on some revisions since then. I've met with department heads. We're trying to set up a format where we can start tracking this data. My goal is by the end of August to kind of have that in place. Some are already doing it. The police department kind of condensed theirs down, which I talked to the chief about, and kind of wanted to see him do that. So something's a little more attainable to start. And then there's still going to be revisions to this, massaging it to get it to a point where the measures are, that we can track them, but also they're attainable. That you don't want to be putting things out there that's just simply between resources and what we've got in place. You don't want to put that on staff. So, but you still keep a high standard and make it challenging. So, so I've been meeting and I'm doing that again with department heads now to flush that out a little bit more, get to the place where we're recording the data, and then in a year's time, look at percentages, or maybe 6 months to a year. So that's kind of the gist of where we're at. I wanted to, you got a copy of the packet of all of them.
I have a question about one measure. I'm not sure I understand. That will disperse the measure for parks and recs as combined acreage in neighborhood community parks, in the range of 6.25 acres to 10.5 acres. Develop open space per 1,000 population. It said we're at 9.42 acres per 1,000. Is that something that they would even be able to control, if I'm understanding, read it correctly?
Yeah, I really
Yeah, there's
don't follow with that too well.
sure there's a chance that's outside their control, but they're also advocating for park space and identifying opportunities for park space. That was a ratio, that I saw from this book that had been done on, what's kind of an ideal ratio of park facilities to population, total population. And we're well within that threshold, so I think that's not something that's, imminent that we fall below that. But then this is also where I talk about massaging this and coming back. That could be one where, with further discussion, okay, that isn't totally within the control of, Parks and Rec staff. So,
And the other part, and the other one I was thinking about, we're just kind of bound by geography, but how much our population is going to increase as well.
yeah, and, we were looking at the Meritor, our town's Meritor property is
Sure.
potential.
We do have verbiage in our subdivision code now too that mandates certain properties be set aside, open space properties in all the subdivisions. As more and more get built, that number will be going up also.
Okay.
Yeah, and this doesn't factor, but that could be factored into the calculation too, which I think is a fair point.
Yeah.
Especially if they're setting aside some meaningful and sometimes open space may have a playground in it,
Yeah.
or a walking path, which gets to kind of park facilities.
Yeah, because I definitely like to see parks expanded, but
Yeah.
as they know how much control they would actually have over that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Good point.
Well, now, percentage of residents who participate in recreation programming offered by the town, I think it's more of a performance measure that those opportunities are available and marketed or put forth and advertised correctly. You really can't do a thing about how many people decide to participate or not, in my opinion. It's kind of a hard thing to measure. Because you can, I think it's more important that it's advertised plenty and timely in a multitude of ways. And then whoever comes. There's not a lot we can do about that. But I also do think that if there's something that's not attended very well, then that's consideration for, after a year or two of scrapping that.
Yes.
A lot of effort for nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wondered about that one too. It's like,
Well, they're responsible for marketing and promoting and,
but I'm just saying percentage of residents is
yeah, I know you can't
hard to
fully,
measure that.
but it's a striving to
Okay.
include and get as many residents, because, we get a lot who aren't residents using services. Of course, we discount a little bit if it's something you have to sign up for and pay. I will say, summer day camp, our resident participation is super high.
Nice.
It's gone up, yeah.
Because that's what
To the,
we want to do.
yeah, and it's in demand.
Benefit
It's,
residents.
right, and I was really, I felt bad, where we felt bad in one respect for some of these outside of town limits who wanted to use it, let's just say they live
You can
nearby,
only do so
wherever.
much.
But it's nice that our residents had that available, and they could sign up first, and then we do that too, and then the non-resident might be the next day, and
Yeah.
it filled up fast, so.
Yeah, we
It's a
can't-
nice service to our residents, and, it gets
We
into.
can't be the answer for the region on something like that. We just don't have the manpower to cover it.
And that's what, in that case, pushes other jurisdictions to
We hope so.
provide parks and rec services, or maybe
Do
not.
their part.
Yeah.
Well, I will say to your point, it could, in fact, you made that, you read that measure, I called it about the concerts in the park. I thought, well, look at the first concert, well attended, but compared to flashback band, the flashback band was 500 plus people, So that doesn't necessarily mean the concert or the parks aren't successful based off that one, but it also could mean that we as council may need to do something different, support parks and rec, to make sure we could get that same attendance. That's a little bit about that.
But even something like that, any outdoor activities,
Yeah.
depending on weather and.
Yeah, so we can control it.
So where are we gonna go from here? Is the next step to go back and put some meat into these things?
Yeah, so start recording data.
Well, no, I mean, when you say, like for recycling collection, percentage of solid waste diverted in a calendar year, that means nothing. Zero is a percentage.
Well, no, we've
Somebody's gotta put some numbers in there that.
Right, so that's why they start gathering the data, so that you have a calculation of what that percentage that's being diverted. Looks like we have solid wastes of our total tonnage that's being diverted for recycling.
The same thing with like all of them, the zoning and planning the same way.
Well, yeah, you gotta start tracking
Yeah.
to see how many have come in, and did you respond to it in that many days? So that's where some of that meat, I think, that Bob's referring to, starts to,
So,
you've got data then that starts tracking that.
so we'll take data for a year and then, or is it,
And see how we're doing on that.
and then, yes.
Yeah.
In 2 years, we'll have data and have it on writing
You
in
can
front
start
of us.
comparing it.
I mean,
as-
I see why you're doing that, but if you're just collecting data the first year, there's no incentive to try to do any better until you put numbers there that it's an actual target.
Sure, if you see it's below
Yeah.
or above,
Yeah.
then you can see, okay, we're
Okay.
hitting that.
And we'll
or
see
we're
where we
not.
have a problem.
And, yeah, and in some instances, it may be, it's like, no way we can get the cars back out in 3 days
Yeah.
on average, right? Like with fleet management. So that's, and I want to be flexible because I don't, we want this to be something that we're striving for and that we can monitor, but it's not, overbearing or unreasonable or not attainable.
I'm just a little concerned that if we don't put a little bit more specifics in here, the measurement may not be consistent. In other words, one person might say, okay, well, we're gonna count this way, another person say, we're gonna count this way. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting out on this, and we got to start somewhere.
Right.
And some of the advice was, don't go huge on this, because then it's overwhelming, and you just flounder. And there'll be some parts of this where we're gonna flounder a little bit, because it's either not something we can hit, or maybe it needs to be described differently. So that's why, but this is, I think a decent starting point, and we'll need to start gathering the data to see the meat in there.
And I like this where it says goal of 5 annually, 98% is your goal. So it kind of gives me a baseline of what
Right.
you're trying to obtain.
Yeah,
Because I wouldn't know that it would be 5 annually otherwise for the recycling.
yeah.
All right, do you have any other questions, comments, concerns here? Like not, we appreciate all your work on that, and moving on to your comments.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, I only had a couple things from last week, and I didn't add anything else. Not much more to report, but to this point, the tennis, basketball, pickleball courts project is moving along. We've got roughly 2 months work left of work on it if things continue to progress as planned. I know right now it doesn't seem like there's a lot of activity. I think they had to let that settle, that base, let that set, and then I believe we'll be seeing more asphalt on there, leveling, and then next thing will be fencing.
Looks good.
Good, yeah.
Looks
I
really
think it
good.
looks good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's exciting.
Yeah, at a glance, it doesn't look that big, but then if you drive over there or you look to the side, it's like, oh yeah, there is a lot here.
Yeah.
And they did supposedly build it so that the water runs off instead of pooling in a pocket.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Good.
And remember, they changed the,
I know the
way
way
the
it's coming
flow,
out.
to the kind of front of it. I think that'll work better. So they're moving forward. Yeah, and the only other item was, you all know we had that meeting with the DOT officials and Representative Jennifer Baucom, and that was back on June the 12th. It was well attended. We invited the public. It was in council chambers here, and it was well attended by mostly residents of Wildwood, who are most directly impacted by the noise out there. And the good news is it's been funded. That's great news. There still is another step, and I had shared with you a map that showed particular addresses in there, and they're coded with these different colored dots, blue and green and yellow, and it's the blue and green and the one red. They're going to have to respond to DOT. They're supposed to get some official notification. I believe it'll be by mail to those property owners, and they've got to respond if they are in favor or support or approve of the sound wall going in. And they've got a sketch where the sound wall will be located. So that's kind of an important next step. They said they thought August in that time frame that would be going out. So we'll just want to know from DOT when that goes, and we'd like to try to, on top of that, some additional follow-up to these property owners to make sure they act on it. Because you know it is, you can get some notification, go to one of these folks, and I didn't get it, or it got set down in a pile there, or, you know. So if they want the sound wall, they've got to, and I don't know the threshold of how many yeses, nos, but they've got to reply to that and indicate a level of support for this.
Did they indicate what a no vote meant? Or something like that?
No, they didn't. And I'll need to find out like what percentage, they didn't say that in the meeting. I think the assumption is pretty much everyone in there is going to want this. It's not gonna be, you know, blight as far as we look at or detriment. It shouldn't be that, if anything, a good screening. These walls are very nicely constructed.
Yeah.
They're fairly attractive as much as a wall can be. And they will lower the decibel levels. It's not a tremendous amount, but it will lower the noise. Of course, as the trees and other things grow up, it'll help absorb, but that's where we're at, and we'd also like to, you know, you can't over-communicate on this, and you just want to make sure people are paying attention and they respond.
And that's what I was gonna say, we need to be closely involved with DOT so that if there's a deadline, that they have to have a certain number turned in, and we see that people aren't responding, if we have to go ourselves, knock on doors and hand them to them, we need to be prepared to do that.
Right, you know, it's, if we have phone numbers, we call. And remember, I believe this, well, I would think it has to go to the property owner's record. So it should go to the, I guess his GIS would show who the property owner is. But some of these homes may be occupied by renters, and so, you know, is the property owner getting that and, oh yeah, I need to respond to this, or, you know, let's just say they're out of state or something.
Well,
Most of the people I think are owner occupied.
Since this is a relatively small population we're talking about, wouldn't it be in our best interest to go ahead and put staff on it and start doing research now to nail down who the owners are, and maybe even call and say, you're gonna be getting something soon.
Right.
Good point.
It's not that many people to contact.
But now they're potentially looking to have this started or finished, I think, what was it, September to November?
Yeah, in the September to November time, I think that's ambitious,
tight,
but
yeah.
yeah, that's design and construction, but apparently they've got some preliminary design they must already done.
Yeah. But we, like you said, we need to stay on it,
Mhm.
make sure we don't miss a deadline.
Just because somebody wasn't contacted.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that. We were prepared to do that. I know, you know, Susan Hefner in our office who works on the newsletter, she had helped in some communication out to the property owner. Well, we put something in the newsletter and got a lot of feedback, but then we did some other, I don't know if she did it by email to them, but anyways, we got a lot of feedback from the property, yeah, I mean, people who commented it, we kept a chart and, you know, individual property owners' names and their concerns about noise and requests, so, yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, that's all I have.
One other thing I want to pass along, I had a little bit of a discussion with Greg Walker the other night at the concert. The day before the concert, I went driving through the park, you know, to look at the progress on the paddleball fields and so on. And when I got down to the very end of the parking lot and turned around, there was an individual out there in the middle of a big open area with an orange vest on, with some kind of device going around like he's looking for a line or something like that. And I asked Greg, well, Greg was there and Mitch, and they said they weren't sure but they had heard that they suspect there's some kind of a gas leak that they're trying to find.
That's what they said, they just suspected it, or they.
That's apparently what they told me. But he said at one time they had a place marked out with flags, and then a couple days later, the flags were gone, they were apparently looking somewhere else, so I don't know what the situation is.
Yeah.
Just looked out at somebody out in the middle of the field looking.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's gas line that goes through.
Oh, yeah,
They
the big
did
gas
that,
line.
they did that upgrade, remember, years ago, when they were, the whole upgrade in the natural gas transmission capabilities because of the transition to the.
Power plant.
Yeah, the power plant to, natural gas from coal.
Are there any other business from council? Hearing none, we have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A motion to adjourn, we have a second.
Second.
A motion and a second, any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of adjourn, say aye.
Uh,
Those opposed?